Welcome back to part 3 of the CISSP Exam Cram series, and today we're covering Domain 3, which is Security Architecture and Engineering. This is a big domain. I have lots of tips for you today, so let's get down to business. So in Domain 3 of the CISSP exam, you are looking at the largest domain in terms of the sheer amount of content that we need to cover, and there's a lot of memorization work for you in here. This is video 3 in the series of 8, 4 through 8 coming pretty quickly in the next few days. And there are a couple of supplemental videos that I want to tell you about here in a minute, because one of those at least will be very helpful in onboarding the information you need to memorize from this domain. So we're looking at security, architecture, and engineering in Domain 3. I have a video on memorization tips, and we cover memory devices using examples from the CISSP exam, and in particular I use some examples from Domain 3 since there's so much work here to do with cryptography and security models. I actually use those as examples. So if you haven't seen this video, take a look. Absolutely worth 20 minutes of your time. I have another one out there on quantitative risk analysis formulas. I had a couple of folks ask for videos focused on these formulas in a hands-on example. So there you have it. Enjoy them. Ping me if questions. So let's get into Domain 3, Lesson 3. We'll take a look at the exam outline. This is the official ISC squared. So we're looking at managing engineering processes. Fundamental concepts of security models. Memorization is going to be absolutely key here. I'm going to feed you some of those memory devices I mentioned. Go watch my video on memorization that will help you with those security models in particular. Selecting controls based on requirements. Security capabilities of information systems. Mitigating vulnerabilities comes up across a number of subjects. Architectures, designs, solution elements, web-based systems, mobile systems, and embedded devices. So mitigating vulnerabilities is different from understanding the attacks on systems. We'll talk about common attacks in other lessons, but you won't hear about most of them here. We're going to be focused on mitigation. Applying cryptography. Cryptography is the most technical concept, the most technical topic on the CISSP exam. I saw quite a few questions from this area. A lot of memorization here. I'm going to show you how to break it down. To kind of chunk this is the technique I use to break this into manageable parts so I can onboard the memorization more quickly. Applying security principles to site and facility design and implementing site and facility controls. So now you're getting more into the physical aspects of security. So let's talk cryptography. So codes versus ciphers. So code are systems of symbols that sometimes imply secret, but don't always have to be secret. Don't always provide confidentiality. Ciphers, on the other hand, are meant to hide the true meaning of a message. So codes are sometimes secret, but don't always provide confidentiality. Ciphers are always secret. Confidentiality is always going to be implied there. So you do need to know the types of ciphers that are out there. So stream cipher, number one, a symmetric key cipher. In a stream cipher, your plain text digit is encrypted one at a time. It's a stream, so to speak, because it's not a block of data. So where a stream cipher goes one character at a time, a block cipher will apply the key and algorithm to a block of data, like 64 contiguous bits, for example. So basically as a group rather than one bit at a time. So that's the fundamental difference between a stream cipher and a block cipher. Substitution. So this is a random bit string. It's basically the same length as the block size that's XORed in the message. So transposition. So transposition, to transpose something means to rearrange, and that's the easy way to remember this, is a transposition cipher is going to rearrange the letters of a plain text message forming a ciphertext message. An initialization vector is also a random bit string. It's an XOR operation that uses the same key length as the block size. So the two things you're remembering here is with initialization vector, is it's an XOR with the message, and it's the same length as the block size. I'll explain what XOR is in just a moment, so stick with me if you don't know exactly what that is. I'll clear that up for you in the next few. But with initialization vectors, it's going to create a unique cipher text every time the same message is encrypted with the same key. So the Caesar, Vigenère, and the one-time pad, these are all stream ciphers. The difference between these ciphers is their key length. So stream cipher, different key length. So Caesar is going to be a key length of 1. And if you think about Caesar back in the day, he was number 1, so key length of 1, it adds up. The Vigenère cipher uses a longer key. It's usually a word or a sentence. And then the one-time pad uses a key length that's as long as the message itself. So Caesar is 1, Vigenère is a word or a sentence, and the key length in a one-time pad is the same length as the message itself. Now we need to talk a bit more about one-time pad. I do expect you're going to see at least a question on this on the exam. So for a one-time pad to be successful, the key must be generated randomly without any known pattern. And it has to be at least as long as the message to be encrypted, because remember, that's what differentiates one-time pad from Vigenère and Caesar. So the key is the same size as the message itself. And the pads must be protected against physical disclosure. You can't give away the secret, right? And each pad must be used only one time and then discarded, because repetition could reveal the answer, right? So basically all of these must be true for a one-time pad to be successful. So a concept here, zero knowledge proof. So this is a communication concept, and basically zero knowledge proof is a specific type of information that's exchanged, but no data is actually transferred. This is true with digital signatures and digital certificates. So what the heck does that mean? Let me give it to you in plain English. To just put it simply, zero knowledge proof enables one to prove knowledge of a fact without revealing the fact itself. So that's, in effect, what digital signatures and certificates allow us to do. Split knowledge. So split knowledge means that the information of the privilege required to perform an operation is divided amongst multiple users. That makes sense, right? Splitting the knowledge amongst multiple people. So this ensures that no single person has sufficient privileges to compromise the security of the environment. It's separation of the knowledge, of the privilege. I kind of think of split knowledge as role separation of a fashion, really. We talk about role separation in the workplace, so one person doesn't have too much privilege that they can carry out some sort of internal threat all on their own. Another concept, work function, sometimes called work factor. So this is a way to measure the strength of a cryptography system by measuring the effort in terms of cost and or time to decrypt the message. So that the cost or time to decrypt the message speaks to the value of the function. So usually the time and effort required to perform a complete brute force attack against an encryption system is what a work function rating represents. So the security and protection offered by the system is directly proportional to the value of the work function or factor. Would you like that in plain English? I hear you. It's the time and effort required to break a protective measure. That's the work factor. So when you hear work function or work factor, think time and effort required to break a protective measure. So the importance of key security. So cryptographic keys provide a necessary element of secrecy, and modern systems utilize keys that are at least 128 bits long to provide adequate security. And that number is going to increase over time. In fact, when we see the rise of quantum computing as a mainstream capability, that's going to change everything about cryptography. We're going to see a massive shift in this space. But know that 128 bits is our low watermark, so to speak, when it comes to key length in modern cryptography. So symmetric versus asymmetric cryptography. So symmetric relies on the use of a shared key. So a shared key versus asymmetric, where we have public-private key pairs for communication between parties. So the difference between the two, number one, symmetric key lacks support for scalability. It's not easy to distribute the key because we only have one key. How do you transmit that key secretly, confidentially between two people? And we don't have a way to implement non-repudiation there, so we can't guarantee the source of the message. Now, asymmetric, on the other hand, basically gives us that capability to implement a solution that guarantees we know who that message came from, but it also makes it easy to distribute that key amongst many parties because we have private and public key pairs to work with. Stick with me, and here in about 5 minutes we'll actually walk through an asymmetric example so you can see how the public-private key pairs are used in a scenario to implement non-repudiation, but also to transmit data confidentially. But symmetric cryptography is going to be faster since we have that shared key. Asymmetric is going to be stronger and more scalable, generally speaking. So when you think symmetric, that's single shared key and it's faster, and asymmetric is a private-public key pair that's going to be stronger than asymmetric, so to speak. So confidentiality, integrity, and non-repudiation are three concepts you'll definitely need to know for the exam. So confidentiality is really focused on the secrecy of data, both while it's in rest or while it's in transit. Integrity basically provides the recipient with an assurance that the data wasn't altered, that the integrity of the data remains, that the data we received is the data that was sent, in other words. And non-repudiation gives us undeniable proof that the sender of a message is the one who actually authored it. It basically prevents the sender from subsequently denying that they sent the original message, which is fantastic in certain circumstances. So you need to be able to explain the 5 basic operational modes of data encryption standard, DES and triple DES. So I'm going to cover these for you in a way that I hope is easier for you to remember, because just looking at them on the surface, they're not just super easy to remember. They don't stand out. So the first is electronic codebook mode. So this is the least secure of the lot. And with codebook mode, it processes a 64-bit block. The problem is, if it encounters the same block multiple times, it produces the same encrypted block, which makes it easy to break. So I like to say this codebook is pretty easy reading. Cipher block chaining. In cipher block chaining, each block of encrypted text is XORed with the block of ciphertext immediately preceding, so the previous link in the chain, so to speak. Cipher feedback is basically cipher block chaining in a streaming version. It's going to work on the data in real time in memory, but do remember, when chaining is involved, errors will propagate. That's a key factor to associate with cipher block chaining and cipher feedback, is when they use chaining, errors propagate. But cipher feedback is basically cipher block chaining in a streaming version working in memory buffers. Now the next one, output feedback, works a lot like cipher feedback, but it XORs the plain text with a seed value, which means we're not using chaining anymore. It's using a seed value instead of that immediately preceding ciphertext. So no chaining means errors don't propagate in this case. And then another variation of that is counter, which uses an incrementing counter instead of a seed. And again, using that incrementing counter is pretty easy to tie to that fifth mode. And then how is triple DES different? Well, triple DES runs DES 3 times with 2 or 3 different keys, to increase the effective key size to 112 or 168 bits, respectively. So let's talk about exclusive OR, XOR. I said we'd get to this. Here we are. So this is a concept that's used pretty heavily in cryptology. It's a lot more complicated than it sounds. It's actually just a flipping of bits in a pretty simple systematic fashion. So you're looking at my table here. You have the original value, the key value, and the cipher value. What you're looking at here is when the binary values match. So when the original and the key value match, you get a 0. When they don't match, original and key value don't match, we get a 1. Simple as that. So that's XOR, exclusive OR. So key clustering is a weakness in cryptography where a plain text message generates identical ciphertext messages using the same algorithm, but using different keys. I'll tell you how I remember this one. I think of key cluster as being similar to collisions in hashing. So hashes have a collision when two different strings produce the same hash. Collisions are exactly why MD5 isn't used as a hashing algorithm anymore. So with key clustering, basically it's when two different keys using the same algorithm produce the same ciphertext. So it's similar to collision in that respect. Is your frontline support struggling with too many Microsoft Cloud portals? Now they can manage Office 365 users and devices directly from Microsoft Teams using Simon, the AI-powered chatbot for the Microsoft Cloud. A link with more info in the video description. So now we're going to talk asymmetric cryptography or public key cryptography. So on the asymmetric side of cryptography, you have public keys that are going to be shared amongst communicating parties. So if you and I are going to communicate and share secrets, you can see you have access to my public key and I have access to yours. My private key is secret. Only I know my private key, and in your case, only you know yours. And in terms of data, to encrypt a message, each can use the recipient's public key. So I can use your public key to encrypt a message, and then you can decrypt it using your own private key. And with a digital signature to sign a message, you're going to use your own private key, which gives us non-repudiation. It ensures that if I digitally sign a message with my private key, it ensures that it was sent by me. And to validate a signature, you'll use my public key. So asymmetric and symmetric can work together in the sense that, remember, symmetric cryptography is fast, right? So we can use asymmetric cryptography to securely transmit the shared key we're going to use in symmetric cryptography. So essentially, asymmetric solves three problems, one of which is distribution of a secret. And with symmetric, that's a problem, right? Sharing that key amongst many parties on the symmetric side would be really difficult, so that's where asymmetric can help out. So just remember, each party has both a private and public key. So let's look at a simple example. We have Franco and Maria. So Franco sends a request to Maria requesting her public key. Maria sends her public key back to Franco. Remember, your public key is shared with all, and Franco is going to encrypt his message using Maria's public key, and she's going to decrypt the message using her private key. As simple as that. And the contents of that message could be anything, including but not limited to a shared key to be used in a symmetric crypto function. So hash function. So a good hash function has 5 requirements. It has to allow input of any length, and it has to provide fixed length output. That is to say, no matter how long the input, the output must always be the same length. The hash must always be the same length. It has to make it relatively easy to compute the hash function for any input, so it needs to be relatively fast in that respect. It has to provide one-way functionality. In other words, it can't be reversed. A hash function that's easily reversed, a two-way functionality, would not be so simple. And it has to be collision-free. Collisions are exactly why the MD5 protocol is not, why MD5 is no longer used as a hashing algorithm. So a collision in hashing means that we could put 2 different inputs through a hash function and it would generate the same output, meaning we can't then determine reliably what the original value was. That's exactly why MD5 is not used anymore. Let's talk about cryptographic salts. So attackers may use something called a rainbow table. It's a table of pre-computed values to try to identify commonly used passwords. And a salt is random data that's used as an additional input to a one-way function that hashes data, password, passphrase, whatever. And because we're injecting random data, adding salts to passwords before hashing them reduces the effectiveness of the rainbow table attacks, because the attacker doesn't know what additional random data has been injected before the hash. So digital signature standard. So DSS uses SHA-1, SHA-2, SHA-3 message digest functions. It used to use SHA-1. Generally speaking, SHA-2 is going to be more common now. The SHA-2 is approved with DSS. And it works in conjunction with one of three encryption algorithms. So it would work with digital signature algorithm, or DSA, an RSA algorithm, or elliptic curve DSA. So public key infrastructure. So this is the certificate server that you'd see commonly in an enterprise environment. So certificate authorities, are sometimes called certification authorities, generate digital certificates that contain public keys of system users. Every certificate has a public key and a private key, to be clear. And the users can distribute the certificates to people with whom they want to communicate. And the recipients verify a certificate using the CA's public key. So that's how one can establish a chain of trust back to the issuing certificate authority. So it goes all the way back to the root certification authority. So in PKI, you'll sometimes have tiers of servers, and you'll have an issuing authority, but you'll have a root authority at the base of the infrastructure. Oftentimes that root authority is maintained offline, but it's using asymmetric in that case. Certs are used for web, network, and email security pretty commonly. So in fact, let's talk about web, network, and email security. So on email, pretty common standards for encrypted messages include SMIME and pretty good privacy. On the website of the house, the de facto standard is HTTP over TLS, Transport Layer Security, which has largely replaced the older SSL standard that was in use for a lot of years. Then on the network side, the IPsec protocol is a pretty standard framework used for encrypting network traffic. You may actually see a bit additional in terms of questions on IPsec. So let's talk about IPsec at some greater depth here. So IPsec is a security architecture that supports secure communications over IP. And it establishes a channel in one of two modes, transport mode or tunnel mode. And it can be used to establish direct communication with computers over a VPN. So I've seen IPsec used between computers without a VPN. VPN is a very common use of IPsec, though. The Windows operating system has capability to do IPsec between computers without a VPN, but you can also establish a VPN. And it uses one of two protocols, authentication header and encapsulating security payload. All right, common cryptographic attacks. Just a couple here you should be familiar with for sure from Domain 3. Brute force attacks, which are attempts to randomly find the correct cryptographic key. So it's just using brute force of computing power with known plain text and chosen ciphertext. But it requires the attacker to have some extra information. There's a meet in the middle attack, which exploits protocols that use 2 rounds of encryption. So it's going to exploit some weaker protocols, and it requires the attacker to know something, somewhere around at least 8 bytes of a message. So if an attacker knew the parties involved and weaker protocols were in play here, a meet-in-the-middle attack might be possible. But it uses, looking for those 2 rounds of encryption would be the key I'd remember for the exam in case this comes up. Man-in-the-middle attack, you'll hear a lot more about. This fools both parties into communicating with the attacker in the middle instead of directly with one another. So each side actually thinks they're communicating with one another, but instead they're communicating with the man in the middle. And a birthday attack is an attempt to find collisions in hash functions. And remember, a collision in a hash function is when a hash function can receive two different values but generates the same output. That's a collision. Then a replay attack is an attempt to reuse authentication requests. So basically, to get the hashed output of the authentication request and to present that. So that's actually pretty common. So digital rights management, you hear this a lot in the entertainment world. So it allows content owners to enforce restrictions on the use of their content by others. So this used to be a big deal in the entertainment world with music back in the day. It's occasionally found in the enterprise protecting sensitive information stored in documents. But the entertainment content is where DRM was always a big discussion, and nobody was ever very happy about it. So let's talk about symmetric algorithms. If you haven't watched my video on memorization techniques for CISSP, you'll get a taste of them here. So I like to break my cryptography down in a process called chunking. So I start by breaking it down to the types of algorithms I need to remember, because this is the most technical topic on the CISSP exam, and it's a big topic. So let's look at symmetric algorithms here. So you need to remember these. You need to know the block size. I try to remember the key size as well, and remember, symmetric from asymmetric. So looking at this table, I see I have a big chunk of algorithms here that have a 64-bit block size, including Blowfish, the DES family, the RC2 through 5. So one of the tricks I use here, so I tie Blowfish and Skipjack together. I remember that they're both 64-bit because Blowfish and Skipjack are both fish. Okay, you're asking what the heck is a skipjack? This is a skipjack. It's a tuna. I've lived near the coast many times, so I happen to know that. And because I know Blowfish and Skipjack are both 64-bit block size, remembering two fish is easy for me, because one fish times two is two fish, right? So that's 128. So two fish is going to be a little more advanced in that respect. And I know that AES is used commonly in the enterprise, so that's advanced as well. So I just kind of tie those together, that the advanced family has a 128-bit block size. And RC5 has three different options there, but I remember that the greatest is the 128. So then you just half that and then half again to get your three RC5 algorithms. And then streaming, doesn't have the block size, right? It's doing it piece at a time as it streams. Okay, hash algorithms. We've talked about these a lot today, right? So these are easy to break down. So I break the MD5 family down. So that's message digest, MD2, 4, and 5. All have a hash value of 128. Also notice that none of those are still in use. Remember I mentioned MD5, which is the newest of the three you see there. None of those are still in use. They were replaced by multiple other functions. And then you have the SHA family, and the SHA family is easy to remember here because this is secure hash algorithm. So you'll notice that with the SHA family, that the name maps to the hash value length. So all of those SHA 224 through 512, these are SHA-2 variants, and essentially the hash value shows up in the name, and SHA-1's not really in use anymore, but the SHA-2 family are still actively used. So make sure you're going to break out the MD family and the SHA families and remember those. The three major public key cryptosystems. So you have RSA, which is probably the most famous. It was developed by three folks back in the 1970s. You have El-Gamal, which is actually an extension of Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and it depends on modular arithmetic. So with RSA, I tie RSA back to prime numbers. So RSA involves the difficulty of factoring the product of prime numbers. Diffie-Hellman relies on modular arithmetic. It's less common than RSA in the last few years, but El-Gamal is based on Diffie-Hellman. And then elliptic curve depends on the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem. And it's going to provide more security than other algorithms when both keys are of the same length. But RSA, I think, is the the most famous of these and the most likely to come up on the exam. But try to kind of tie some of these key facts about these three into your head so you can pick the right one out should a question come up. So digital signatures. So digital signatures rely on public key cryptography and hashing functions. So digital signatures have to use SHA-2 nowadays. And there are three currently approved encryption algorithms for digital signatures. You've got DSA, you've got RSA, and you've got elliptic curve DSA. All right, asymmetric algorithms. So we just touched on RSA, ElGamal, and ECC, and remember ElGamal is based on Diffie-Hellman key exchange, right? So this is a small table to memorize. I didn't give you much in terms of memory devices here because it's pretty small, but these are your asymmetric. So I use a method called chunking. I basically break out the symmetric and the hashing and the symmetric, and then kind of subdivide between there. Because you remember on the symmetric side, I broke out the MD family and the SHA family. So if you haven't watched it, go back and watch my memory video. It's absolutely worth it. Okay, security models are going to be a huge topic on the exam as well. Huge is overstating it. It's going to factor prominently, and there are quite a few security models here. We're going to use some memory techniques to remember these as well. So let's get into it. And I like to chunk these as well. I like to break them out into models that focus on integrity and those that focus on confidentiality. So on the integrity side, we have the BIBA model, which is a state machine model. We have Clark-Wilson, which is home to something called the access control triple. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then there's Goguen-Mizguir, which is the non-interference model. I'm sure I butchered that name. And then Sutherland, which also prevents interference. So based on information flow and state machine model as well. And then on the confidentiality side, we have Bell-LaPadula, which features the no read up, no write down concept we'll get to in just a moment. We have Brewer and Nash, home of the Chinese wall concept, and then Take Grant, which employs a directed graph. With Bell-LaPadula, no read up, no write down, I always tie in my mind, but I always remember that Bell-LaPadula is used by the government as well, and the rest of these are largely going to be commercial. The other thing I remember is Bell-LaPadula is no read up, no write down, and the others tend to be no write up, no read down. So Bell-LaPadula is kind of the one I tie everything else to and trying to kind of break those out. Like Clark-Wilson, for example, access controlled triple is a distinction there that may come out in an exam. So we'll get into these in more detail, but it starts with chunking by breaking these out into the models that focus on integrity and those that focus on confidentiality. So for the exam, though, remember, if the question's about lattice, the answer is likely Clark-Wilson, and lattice refers to lattice-based access control, which is an access control system that focuses on interaction between objects and subjects. So the subject is the person or system accessing a resource, and the object is the resource being accessed. So Bell-LaPadula, I remember, is for government. The rest are largely commercial. And I also remember that Bell-LaPadula is no read up, no write down, and the others tend to be the opposite of this. No write up, no read down. More on what the heck that means in just a moment. So Bell-LaPadula, this is a state machine model that enforces confidentiality. So a state machine is a concept used in designing computer programs. Let me break that out for you separately in just a moment. But Bell-LaPadula is a state machine model that enforces confidentiality. It uses mandatory access control to enforce the DoD multi-level security policy. So think government when Bell-LaPadula comes up. So the simple security property, it means a subject cannot read data at a higher level of classification. That is no read up. So think about secret classifications in the government all the way up to top secret. So a subject at G14 can't read up to security at G15. I'm making up that classification, but you get my point. And then the star security property says the subject cannot write info down to a lower level of classification. There's no write down. So what that would mean is if I'm at G15, I can't just unilaterally declassify some information or downclassify information from G15 to G14 so other people can read it. So here's how I remember this. I use a PicMonic, which is a memory device using a picture. So Bell LaPadula, so that gives me an obvious picture in my mind, right? A bell. And so I know that this algorithm is no read up, no write down. So I think read up going up one side of the bell and no write down going down the other. And there's an acronym here. So I like to try to take that no read up, no write down and turn that into an acronym. So no running under nets with Dingo. So you'll hear some of this over in my memory devices video around CISSP because the security models and the algorithms that are in Domain 3 here are really tough for people to memorize. Excuse me. And they tend to be very common topics on the exam, so they're things you definitely need to remember. But like I say, because Bell LaPadula is unique from all the others in a couple of ways, I try to use this as my anchor to help remember everything else more easily. So moving on, the BIBA model. This is another lattice-based model, so lattice-based access control, focusing on interaction between subjects and objects. And this is an integrity-based model. It enforces integrity. So the simple integrity property ensures a subject at one level is not permitted to read an object of lower integrity, no read down. And the star integrity property is an object at one level of integrity is not allowed to write to an object of higher integrity, so no write up. And there's an invocation property here. It prohibits a subject at one level of integrity from invoking a subject at a higher level of integrity. So I mentioned simple and star property. The simple property is always the read property. The star property is always the write property in these security models. So another one likely to come up, Clark-Wilson. So this is another lattice-based model developed to address integrity. So both integrity models, both commercially used. So simple integrity, again, no read down. Star integrity, no write up. So remember, these are the opposite of the Bell LaPadula. They're commercial and they're no read down, no write up. Now Clark-Wilson, I mentioned, features the access control triple, and that's a definite distinction, and now you're asking what the heck is an access control triple. So the access control triple is composed of a user, a procedure, or a transformational procedure they call it, and a constrained data item. It was basically designed to protect integrity and prevent fraud, and basically ensuring that authorized users can't change data in an inappropriate way. All right, so the take grant model, another one I mentioned. So take grant is another confidentiality-based model that supports 4 basic operations: take, grant, create, and revoke. Brewer and Nash, also called the Chinese wall model, was developed to prevent conflict of interest problems. It's another confidentiality-based. The Graham-Denning model. This model uses a formal set of protection rules for which each object has an owner and a controller. And it's focused on secure creation and deletion of both subjects and objects. And it has Graham-Denning has a collection of 8 primary protection rules that define the boundaries of certain secure actions. It's actually worth remembering those because they're easy to remember. You can securely create or delete a subject or an object, and you can securely provide the read, grant, delete, and transfer access rights. So these are the 8 rules of Graham-Denning. Worth committing those to memory as well, I should think. All right. So security modes. It starts with dedicated mode. So security clearance permits access to all information processed by a system, approval for all, and valid need to know for all. So that's dedicated mode. All, right? Access, approval, and need to know. Multi-level mode, on the other hand, can process information at different levels, even when all system users don't have the required security clearance to access all information processed by the system. So there are some distinctions there. So the key there is when all users don't have the required security clearance, multi-level mode can be very useful. System high mode requires that each user have valid security clearance, access approval for all information processed by the system, and valid need to know for at least some of the info on the system. This offers, of all the models, this offers the most granular control over resources and users. And then there's compartmented mode, which goes one step further than system high. In compartmented mode, each user has to have valid security clearance and access approval for all info based processed by the system, but it also requires valid need to know for all info. So that's how compartmented varies from system high, is that it requires valid need to know for all info as opposed to only some. So before it gets away from me, let's talk about the state machine model, which I said those security models that we talked about a minute ago are based on. So a state machine model describes a system that's always secure no matter what state it's in. So it's based on the computer science definition of a finite state machine. So a state is a snapshot of a system at a specific moment in time, and all your state transitions, the transition from one state to another, has to be evaluated, like the transition from on to off, for example. But if each possible state transition results in another secure state, then a system can be called a secure state machine. So that's the key. And an information flow model focuses on the flow of information. Information flow models are actually based on a state machine model. So Biba and Bell-LaPadula are both information flow models. Remember, they were looking at no read up, no write down. They're talking about the flow of information in read and write, to simplify that. Bell-LaPadula in preventing information flow from a high security level to a low security level, right? Remember, it was no write down. And Biba focuses on flow from low to high. Remember, no write up. So Bell-LaPadula focuses on enforces confidentiality. Biba focuses on integrity. All right, trusted computing base. You're going to expect it to be able to define a trusted computing base, which is a combination of hardware, software, and controls that work together to form a trusted base to inform your security policy. It's a subset of a complete information system. It's the portion that can be trusted to enforce your security policy, to always adhere to your security rules. Now, security perimeter is another topic that may come up on the exam. You'll be expected to know what that is. A security perimeter is an imaginary boundary that separates the trusted computing base from the rest of the system, from the not secure parts of the system. So trusted computing base has to create secure channels, trusted paths to communicate with the rest of the system. And it protects users from compromise, essentially. So reference model and security kernel, two concepts that'll come up on the exam potentially as well. So the reference monitor, is the logical part of the trusted computing base that confirms whether a subject has the right to use a resource prior to granting access. And the security kernel is a collection of trusted computing base components that implement functionality of the reference monitor. So security kernel implements access control, and reference model enforces it. Basically, if we boil it down. Hopefully that helps kind of solidify that a little more simply than what the official text will tell you. So let's talk about common criteria. So common criteria enable an objective evaluation to validate that a product or a system satisfies a set of security requirements. So, and then there are two related concepts we want to talk about. Trusted computer system evaluation criteria, which was a previous standard that used a structured set of criteria for evaluating computer security within products. And there was another called Information Technology Security Evaluation Criteria. So TCSEC, ITSEC. And ITSEC represents kind of the first attempt to create a security evaluation criteria. It's really here for historical purposes. In fact, common criteria has largely replaced or superseded both of these. Now, you'll be expected to remember the classes of protection for the exam. It's actually called out in the official study guide. So here are a comparison of the classes of these three standards. So the comparison here, you notice that there are 7 levels there. There's actually more than that in some cases. This is where I think you need to focus on the exam. And if you felt like these were really difficult to memorize, which I do think they are, there's not much of a memory device I can give you here. I would start by memorizing the common criteria, given that is going to be the most common in terms of practice, and these others are going to be a bit more historical to varying degrees. Covert channels. You'll be expected to know what a covert channel is. So a covert channel is a method used to pass information over a path that's not normally used for communication. And because it's not normally used, it may not be protected by the system's normal security controls. So, for example, steganography, the process of transmitting information embedded in a photograph. Basically, a way to covertly pass information through a seemingly benign object. But it's not normally used. It may not be protected by the system's normal security controls, as in the case of steganography, right? There's two types of covert channels. There's covert timing and covert storage. So timing channels are based on the time it takes to access certain components, like a system's paging rate, the time a certain transaction takes to execute, or the time it takes to get access to a shared bus. And the storage channel occurs when out-of-band data is stored in a message. So ICMP, what's used for ping, that protocol will sometimes have some extra information in the packets, which will tell us something about the identity of the target operating system. So an attacker can use that extra information. Covert channels are difficult to detect because it's outside normal communication channels. So trusted platform module. So this is a chip that resides on the motherboard of a device. It's really commonly used in the Windows operating system and Linux as well, for that matter. It's multi-purpose. It's like storage and management for keys used for disk encryption, for example. But it provides the operating system with access to keys, but prevents component removal and access, essentially. But the TPM is a chip, and you're going to find it in all your modern laptops these days. So let's talk about types of access control, starting with mandatory access control. And this is a policy that's determined by the system, not the owner. So there is a mandatory access control system in place that the user cannot, that the object owner can't define, and it relies on classification labels that are representative of security domains. Discretionary access control allows the owner or creator of an object to control access at their discretion. That's how you remember discretionary access control. Access control is at the discretion of the owner or creator. Non-discretionary access control enables enforcement of system-wide restrictions that override object-specific access control. And rule-based access control defines specific functions for access to requested objects, specific functions or rules for access. So remember, discretionary is at the discretion of the owner or creator. Non-discretionary is system-wide, and mandatory is determined by the system, not the owner. So role-based access control, or RBAC, as you're often going to hear it called, this uses a well-defined collection of named job roles to endow someone with specific permissions. For example, in the cloud, in Microsoft Azure, we have a global administrator who has access to everything. We have an access administrator. That role can handle issues with relation to access. There is a security reader role that has permission to read security information throughout the system. So role-based access control is something you'll hear out there frequently, and it'll have a role that you can then assign users or groups to, quite typically, if you think about it in the Windows context. So back to mandatory access control. Your Mac models are going to work on one of three environment types, classifications. You've got a hierarchical environment where the labels are assigned in an ordered structure from low to high security, low to medium to high. You have compartmentalized, which requires specific security clearances over compartments or domains instead of objects. And then you have the hybrid environment, which combines hierarchical and compartmentalized. So the security levels, you have security levels, and within those levels you have subcompartments. So that's going to be the most granular and flexible of the three. A key point about the Mac model, though, is that every object and every subject has one or more labels, classification labels. They're predefined, and the system determines access based on the assigned labels. So let's talk about just a few terms here. So certification, this is the technical evaluation of each part of a computer system to assess its concordance with security standards. That's the official definition. What the heck does concordance mean? Well, it really means agreement or alignment or compliance with security standards. And then accreditation is the process of formal acceptance of certified configuration from a designated authority. It's one thing to have a certified, technical compliance. Accreditation is where a governing body then certifies that configuration. An open system. These are designed using industry standards. They're usually easy to integrate with other open systems. And then you have, by comparison, a closed system that's generally proprietary hardware or software. And with these, they're kind of black box. Their specs aren't normally published. They're going to be harder to integrate because they are what we'd call a black box. They're proprietary and secret to a degree. So techniques for ensuring CIA. What do I mean by CIA? No, I'm not talking about the CIA, the government CIA. I'm talking about the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So confinement restricts a process to reading from and writing to certain memory locations. Bounds are the limits of memory a process can't exceed when reading or writing. And isolation is the mode a process runs in when it's confined through the use of memory bounds. So definitely know the definitions for confinement, bounds, and isolation, because these are all techniques for ensuring CIA. So let's talk about authentication factors. So with multi-factor authentication, you can have something like a PIN or a password, something you have like a trusted device. It's quite common in secure environments that you have to authenticate with something and you have to be attempting to authenticate from a device that is trusted. It's known to not be compromised. It complies with the organization's standards. And then something you are, like biometric, like Windows Hello does face scanning. When you go to secure data centers, many times there's a biometric mechanism like a retina scan or maybe even a fingerprint. Auth-in and Auth-Z, this is authentication and authorization. So authentication, auth-in, is the process of proving that you are who you say you are. And then authorization is the act of granting an authenticated party permission to do something. So that's identity and access control, if I were to say it another way. So permissions, rights, and privileges are granted to users based on their identity, and if a user has rights to a resource, they are granted authorization. That's basically auth-in and auth-Z. And authentication can be achieved with both symmetric and an asymmetric crypto systems, but whether it's symmetric or asymmetric will also factor in on the how secure it is and the speed, right, and how scalable. Okay, so a few terms around X here. So multitasking. This is simultaneous execution of more than one application on a computer, and it's managed by the operating system. So I can run multiple applications on Windows or on my mobile phone. Multi-threading permits multiple concurrent tasks to be performed within a single process. So multi-threading gives me multiple threads within a process. So multiple concurrent tasks is the key to remember in multi-threading. Then there's multiprocessing, which is the use of more than one processor to increase computing power. Pretty much everything I can think of in terms of standard, desktop and laptop computing devices now have long supported more than one processor. And then in the mainframe world, we have something called multiprogramming. It's similar to multitasking, but it takes place on mainframe systems and requires some specific programming. So think about multiprogramming as multitasking for mainframe. That's the bottom line there. So single state and multi-state processor, pretty simple. Single state processors are capable of operating only one security level at a time, and multi-state can operate at multiple levels of security. Okay, processor operating modes. There's user mode, which is where applications operate with limited instruction sets. So these are going to be your ordinary end user operations typically. And then privileged mode are where it's known as system mode or kernel mode or sometimes supervisory mode. But this is where controlled, secure, privileged operations occur. So it's often going to be a protected area in terms of memory and or processor and storage access. But think controlled operations. I think of user as end user operations and privileged as system or administrator operations. So memory, you're going to be expected to know the different memory types from ROM, which is read-only memory, to RAM, to programmable ROM, to EEPROM, EEPROM, and flash memory. So these are going to give you want to memorize these in the context that I've put here. So for example, with EEPROM, you have a small window that when illuminated can erase the content of a chip, because one of the aspects of security comes down to secure erasure of information from storage, right? Because sometimes we can erase information from storage, but it's not truly erased. It's still accessible through forensic means to a skilled person. So memorize your memory types. Memorize your memory. So security issues with storage. So primary storage is the same as memory, the primary classification. Secondary storage consists of magnetic flash and optimal media that first has to be read into primary memory before the CPU can use the data. And then random access storage devices can be read at any point in time. And sequential access storage requires scanning through all the data physically stored before the desired location. So you have to access all the data in order. So sequential would be difficult to leverage in some circumstances. Three main security issues around secondary storage, so not memory, right? Removable media can be used to steal data. I can plug a USB key into a computer, copy some data, and walk out the door, right? So we have to secure that channel of moving data. Access controls and encryption have to be applied to protect data, right? We have to apply some sort of limitation of access, role-based access control, for example. And data can remain on the media even after file deletion or media formatting, what I just mentioned, right? That when you delete the file, you're not always deleting the file. I can use forensic means to find that data after you've deleted it. So you want to be very aware of that. Input and output devices. So input and output devices are going to be subject to eavesdropping and tapping. So think back to phone systems. Tapping a phone used to be a common mechanism for breaching security of voice conversations. A network connection, a network cable, can be tapped as well. We can tap directly into a cable with something called a vampire tap. So eavesdropping and tapping are used to smuggle data out of an organization. So you have to be careful about securing entry points into your environment. This is really where physical security starts to come into play. We have to secure the wiring closet, for example. And we'll talk about securing a wiring closet in a bit. So the purpose of firmware, you'll be expected to know what firmware actually does. It's basically a software that's stored on a read-only memory chip, and it contains basic instructions needed to start a computer or a peripheral device like a printer. So vulnerabilities, threats, countermeasures, let's talk about processes. So process isolation ensures that individual processes can only access their own data. So one process can't read from another. You can imagine if an attacker knew they could read other processes, that would be an interesting channel for them to pursue. Layering creates different security realms within a process and limits communication between them. And then abstraction creates a black box interface for programmers to use without knowledge of the device's inner working. So you'd see abstraction in a proprietary system. And then data hiding prevents information from being read at a different security level. So hardware segmentation enforces process isolation with physical security controls, but it prevents information. Data hiding prevents information from being read from a different security level. So that's the key to remember there. So the role of security policy. So the role of a security policy is to inform and guide the design, development, implementation, testing, and maintenance of a particular system. So we start, for example, with our organization's security policy, and that gives us the rules that we need to adhere to in designing and implementing a solution to solve a problem. That gives us the security standards by which we go. It may be the organization, it could be a governing body in the case of a regulated environment. PCI DSS, for example, lays out policy related to handling credit card data, for example. Cloud computing. You'll be expected to know what cloud computing is, right? So this is where processing and storage is performed somewhere else over a network connection rather than locally. So really commonly you can think Azure, Amazon, and Google Cloud, which have their own data centers that you can rent time in. You pay for what you use, essentially. And sensitive and confidential data can be at risk if the cloud provider and their personnel don't adhere to the same security standards as your organization. I tend to think with the major cloud providers, it's actually more secure. And all three of these providers are going to give you some way to see the security standards to which they adhere and for which they are certified. Azure, last I looked, is the most certified in terms of the various standards they adhere to. I'm a big believer that in the cloud, the major providers these days do it better than the average IT department can do in their own data center. I think the cloud's come a long way in that respect. Hypervisors. You're expected to know what a hypervisor is and the two types. So there's a type 1 hypervisor, which is a native or bare metal hypervisor. So you can think of an ESXi server from VMware. That's basically, there's no operating system you're logging into and using and then launching virtual machines. It's just bare metal running VMs. That's its sole purpose. Hyper-V has a type 1 hypervisor option as well. And then there's a type 2 hypervisor, which is a hosted hypervisor. So a couple of things you could think about here would be, on Windows 10, for example, you can light up the Hyper-V feature and you can, in the Windows 10 GUI, create and launch virtual machines. That would be kind of a type 2 scenario. Other type 2 hypervisors, Oracle VirtualBox, VMware Workstation, where you've got a GUI and then you can then go in and mess with your virtual machines. A CASB, a Cloud Access Security Broker. So this is a security policy enforcement solution that can be installed on premises or in cloud. So CASBs haven't been around that long. You'll often hear CASBs mentioned with the phrase shadow IT, because we can use CASBs to enforce security policies to ensure that only secure applications are used in our environment and that our data is not stored in unauthorized repositories. So we can make sure that if we're using cloud storage, that it's only approved or sanctioned storage locations. Security as a service, basically a cloud provider concept where security is provided to an organization through or by an online entity. And there are many flavors of security as a service. There are many services that you can acquire in the cloud to protect information, identities, security information event management systems, which can do some centralized processing of your environment. So really just think of security as a service as outsourcing the security function. Smart devices. So smart devices are typically mobile devices that offer customization options, often through installing apps, and they might use, technology on the device or in the cloud. The AI can be local or it can be cloud-based. Internet of Things. So that's a class of devices connected to the internet. You'd be familiar with Internet of Things. That can include all the devices in your home automation, your home assistant like Google or Alexa. Or Siri, for example, or a car connected to the internet, right? So there are billions of devices that fall into the world of Internet of Things, or IoT, it's called. So be basically familiar with what Internet of Things refers to. So mobile device and mobile app security. This is a big space. You'll need to know some of the basics here. So a range of potential security features available to a mobile device could include encrypting the device, which is very common with both iOS and Android, remote wiping a device, and typically you can wipe just business data. You can do what they call a selective wipe with the right management software, so you can wipe just the business data off a device. locking screens, requiring pins, GPS, controlling which applications access which types of data. Which leads me to the reality here that mobile application security is also pretty important and likely to come up on any question around mobile devices. So these are applications that need to be secured, and could be related to securing through credentials, application whitelisting, etc. And in the world of enterprise computing, BYOD, bring your own device, is really popular in large companies, and that's a policy that allows employees to use their own personal device to access business information and resources. This tends to make people happier, but it increases our security risk because we have to put some boundaries around what type of device they can bring and what applications they can use to access our corporate data. So that's where device security and mobile application security factor in. And your major platforms nowadays, major mobile device management platforms nowadays, give us the ability to manage the device and to manage applications on devices that we cannot fully control. MDMs would include things like Microsoft Intune, AirWatch, MobileIron. Quite a few mobile device management platforms out there. Intune and AirWatch are two that come to mind that give us the capabilities we're talking about here. So let's talk about embedded systems and static environments. So an embedded system is typically designed around a limited set of specific functions in relation to a larger product for which it's a component. Lots of devices that fall into this category: motion sensors, lighting systems, cash registers, digital signature pads, Wi-Fi routers. And then static environments are applications. OS's hardware sets are networks that are configured for a specific need, capability, or function, and they're set to remain unaltered. Change is reality in this world, but they're set. They mean set to remain unaltered, even through interaction with people, with users and administrators. And both of these need to be managed. And managing these, you can use network segmentation, security layers, firewalls, manual updates, controlling your firmware versions. Any sort of wrappers around these, but just understand the basic definitions. I don't expect to see a lot of focus on this on the exam, but just FYI. Privilege and accountability. So there's the principle of least privilege. This is a foundational component of secure computing, and separation of privilege. So least privilege ensures that only a minimum number of processes are authorized to run in supervisory mode. This also factors in when we grant people role-based access control. The principle of least privilege means we give someone the permissions they need to do their job and no more. And separation of privilege increases the granularity of secure operations by separating the privileged operations any one entity can perform, be that a system or a person. So we sometimes call that, in the world of people, we call that role separation. Maybe the same person can't establish permissions who then administers the system. Somebody else grants permissions. They are the access administrator, and then somebody else performs the technical functions of the system administrator. So accountability ensures that through all of this, an audit trail exists so we can trace operations back to their source. So if permissions are granted at a higher level for someone, we know who or what did that. And if we don't have proper, separation of privilege, there's an audit trail that shows us where one person maybe was temporarily granted elevated privileges, performed multiple operations that broke our separation of privilege clause, and moved on. Okay, common flaws and vulnerabilities. We have the buffer overflow, and this occurs when a programmer fails to check the size of input data prior to writing data to a specific memory location. So if software is poorly written and it doesn't check the size of the data, it can potentially overwrite the bounds of memory for which it's been granted access, and potentially overwrite more important or other important data, which can cause a system to malfunction in a number of ways, including crash. Back in the early days of computing, buffer overflows were really common. In addition to buffer overflows, programmers can leave backdoors and privileged programs on a system after it's deployed. That's where we have to employ security policies and standards and tooling to ensure that we catch anything installed on a system that shouldn't be there. Even well-written systems can be susceptible to what we call time of check to time of use attacks. So any state change presents an opportunity for an attacker to compromise a system. So if I get credentials at one time, credentials captured at one time, used at another, can factor. For example, in a replay, I think of a replay attack as something I can relate to this, because in a replay attack, I capture credentials and then I attempt to reuse those credentials at a later time. So I think of that as kind of an equivalent concept to time of check, time of use attacks. Functional order of security control. So your security controls should be laid out in this order. So a deterrence control basically discourages behavior. A deterrence control could be a security policy or a posted sign, for example. So it's not an outright blockage of a negative or malicious behavior. Denial, if deterrence doesn't work, then we should be able to deny the behavior, the access. So for example, locked vault doors or a front desk with a security guard. If denial fails, then we need a detection control to detect the intrusion. For example, motion sensors. And if detection doesn't work, then we need to have a delay in place here to ensure that the intruder or the malicious entity is delayed sufficiently in their access attempts to enable somebody to respond. For example, like a cable lock on an asset. It's important to remember this order when you're deploying physical security controls. First deterrence, then denial, then detection, then delay. So think of it in that order. We discourage the behavior. If discouragement doesn't work, we deny. If somebody goes ahead and they get past our denial, we need to detect the negative behavior in action and then try to delay its completion. Now we're going to dive into a wide range of material around physical security, and this is super important because it's an area that many IT folks haven't spent a lot of time with. So physical security controls can be divided into three groups: administrative, logical, also known as technical. If you see technical controls or logical controls, two ways to say the same thing, and physical controls. Now I have some listed here. I want to break these out in a way that's easier for you to memorize. So let's start with the logical controls, the technical controls. So these will be items like access controls, intrusion detection, alarms, closed circuit TV and monitoring, HVAC systems in your data centers, power supplies, fire detection and suppression. And we'll dig into some of these individual areas momentarily here. So administrative controls are more focused on policies and procedures, facility construction, facility selection, picking the right site, site management, having proper procedures for managing your site, personnel controls, employee policies, security awareness training, emergency response, and then within emergency response, having emergency procedures laid out at the step-by-step level. So administrative controls can be wide-ranging. And then physical controls for physical security are exactly what they sound like. This will be things like fences, lights, locks, construction materials, man traps to allow only one person in at a time, bollards to keep someone from driving up on a facility, dogs, guards, quite a few options there. But remember, for the exam, there's no security without physical security. Without control over the physical environment, no amount of administrative or technology is going to provide adequate security. That's bottom line. If a malicious person can gain access to your facility or your equipment, like your wiring closet, they can do just about anything they want, from destroying equipment outright to disclosing or changing configurations in a way that may be difficult for you to recover from. So in terms of physical security controls, know your fences. So 3 to 4 feet, for example, deters a casual trespasser. If you're trying to deal with serious intruders, 8 feet with barbed wire. Temperature. Understand that temperatures for computers, 60 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit in the ideal range. That's 15 to 23 Celsius. Computer damage at 175 Fahrenheit. Storage device damage at 100. And your ideal humidity is 40 to 60%. There are negative consequences on both sides of that, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Electrical impacts. Know the difference between a blackout, a brownout, fault, surge, spike, sag. And I've labeled them here to the degree that they will differentiate enough for you to remember for the exam. So a blackout is prolonged loss of power, where a brownout, for example, is just prolonged low voltage, where your electricity is not consistent and clean. So remember these 6 for sure. Light. Know that lights 8 feet high with 2 feet of candle power is the magic are the magic numbers for security controls. Okay. Humidity and static. So when we're dealing with humidity, too much humidity, if we get much over 60%, we can get to a situation where we have condensation that can cause corrosion. Condensation is going to be bad for equipment, right? And too little humidity causes static electricity. Even on a non-static carpet, low humidity can generate a 20,000 volt static discharge, which is enough to damage just about any sort of equipment. Let's talk about fire suppression agents. And we're going to go from Class A to Class D. So Class A are going to be your common combustibles like wood and paper, and these can be extinguished with water or soda acid. Class B, boil, and you notice I have the acronyms there. So ash, boil. So Class B, boil. These are burning alcohol, oil, and other petroleum products like gasoline. These are extinguish with gas or soda acid. You should never use water on a Class B fire, period. Class C, these are electrical fires that are fed by the electricity that started them. So electrical fires are conductive fires, and the agent has to be non-conductive. Meaning it cannot conduct electricity like any type of gas. And incidentally, when you disconnect the power source, the electrical fire then becomes another class of fire based on what is burning. So when we remove the power source, it becomes a Class A, B, or D fire. And then but any type of gas is good for electrical fire because we need something that doesn't conduct electricity. Water would be catastrophic, for example. Class D, these fires are burning metals and they're extinguished with dry powder. When you get into these odd classes of fire like Class D, these are scary because these are putting these out are not going to be common knowledge. Your organization has to be prepared for these, right? Class K is a kitchen fire. That's going to be like burning oil or grease. Wet chemicals are used to extinguish Class K fires. I'm not convinced you'll see anything about kitchen fires on the exam. I put it on there just in case. Offices have kitchens, right? So worth mentioning, I think. There are 3 categories of fire detection, though. They include smoke sensing, flame sensing, and heat sensing. So know your 3 categories of fire detection as well. Fire extinguisher classes and suppression agents in a table here. If you want to memorize these with a bit less detail, there's just a table that very goes out for you a little more cleanly. Voltage and noise. So you have 2 types of electromagnetic interference. You have common mode noise, which is generated by the difference in power between the hot and the ground wires of a power source. And then you have traverse mode noise, which is generated by the difference in the hot and the neutral wires. So that's the key differentiators between the 2 that I would memorize. And radio frequency or RFI interference is generated by electrical appliances, light sources, cable circuits, etc. Really, anything running on electricity, right? Voltage, I mentioned static voltage earlier. Here are some common levels of static, thresholds of static voltage damage. You should probably be familiar with this. This isn't the first thing I'd memorize, but if you can park these voltage levels in your head, it's worth doing. Right, so damage from fire suppression itself. So the destructive elements of a fire include smoke and heat, but also the suppression medium. So like water or soda acid, what we're using to suppress the fire can cause damage. So smoke is damaging to most of your storage devices. Heat can damage any electronic or computer component. Suppression mediums can cause a variety of problems. Short circuits, they can initiate corrosion, or otherwise just render equipment useless. You might put the fire out, and really, the suppression medium might be so damaging that really all you're saving is human life, because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing, right? All of these issues have to be addressed when designing a fire response system, but at the end of the day, the number one concern is always going to be human safety. So if you are faced with any sort of choose the best answer, if or the most important, human safety is always going to be at the top of the list. So water suppression systems. So pre-action systems use closed sprinkler heads, and the pipe is charged with compressed air instead of water. The water's held in check by electronically operated sprinkler valves and the compressed air. These are going to be good for areas with people and computers. Wet pipe systems are filled with water. Dry pipe systems contain compressed gas. Dry pipe systems also have closed sprinkler heads. The difference is the pipes are filled with compressed air, not water. The water's held back by a valve that remains closed as long as there's enough air pressure in the pipe. So this is used in areas a lot of times where water might freeze, like parking garages. Deluge systems are pretty similar to dry pipe systems, except the sprinkler heads are open, and they're larger than dry pipe heads. That's why you get a deluge, a large amount. The pipes are empty at normal air pressure. The water's held back by a deluge valve, but the sprinkler heads are going to be larger, which means they can disperse more water more quickly. But also remember, just as oil and water don't mix, water and electricity do not mix, right? So that's always an easy answer when you're thinking about those classes of fire. Electrical in particular, we know we're not going to use anything that conducts electricity, which would include water. Gas discharge. So gas discharge systems tend to be more effective than water systems, but they shouldn't be used in environments where people are located, because gas discharge systems work by removing oxygen from the air. So gas discharge and people don't mix, okay? Halon is effective. It's bad for the environment, though. It's ozone depleting, and it turns to toxic gas at 900 Fahrenheit. Note to self. And suitable replacements. A number of suitable replacements here: Argon, Energen, Aero-K. So there's a list here. Do your best to memorize this. This is down in the nooks and crannies. I'm not sure how detailed a question would ever get to get down to these levels, but know that halon is effective as a gas system, but it's bad for the environment, so other gases would be suitable replacements for that reason. So lock types. You've got electronic combination locks, which would be like a cipher lock. That's something you know. Keycard systems, which would be something you have, the key card in your hand, right? Biometric systems, something you are, like a retina scan, a fingerprint scanner. Conventional locks, where we use a key. So those are easily picked or bumped, and keys can be duplicated, right? Conventional locks are going to be the least secure of the lot often. Pick and bump resistant locks are expensive, but they make it harder to pick, and keys aren't as easily duplicated. So if you're going to go with conventional locks, the pick and bump resistant locks are better. So for the exam, though, remember that locks can be picked and which need to be bumped. Remember how high lights and fences need to be, right? So we said lights 8 feet to candle power at 2, and fences need to be 8 feet to deter serious intruders, right? Know the difference, the different physical controls related to entry, and I want to just mention a couple here. So this is a man trap, in case you've never seen it. Somebody mentioned out in one of the public forums that they got a question on not a man trap, but I wanted to show you that in case you don't know what a man trap is. So you see, basically, the door opens, one person can go in, and then when they're cleared, the door on the other side opens. And then a bollard. Bollards are these poles. You'll see these in front of office buildings. These show up in front of even grocery stores and prevent somebody from driving into a facility. That's what a bollard does. So just in case you've never seen them, now you've seen them. So site selection and facility design. So know the key elements in site selection and facility design. So for site selection, visibility is important. Composition of the surrounding area, how accessible is the area, and what are the effects of natural disaster. So in terms of visibility, can I see threats coming, right? Are there elements in the surrounding area that could hurt me? Am I building a building next to a cliff where rocks could fall? If I have a natural disaster, am I building near the edge of a riverbank and an earthquake, causes our building to fall into the water? We need to think about all those elements in site selection. And for facility design, we need to think about the level of security that our organization requires and planning for that before we begin construction, because we have to deal with a variety of factors when it comes to physical security, right? We have to have controls for entry. We can think about those things like bollards to prevent people from driving into a facility if driving into a facility would be a desirable way to breach our site. Know how to design and configure secure work areas. So there shouldn't be equal access to all locations within a facility, which you probably know. So areas with the high value assets require restricted access. And your valuable assets, your confidential assets, they should be located at the heart or the center of protection provided by the facility. There should be layers of access controls and preventative measures in place. So centralized server or computer rooms don't necessarily need to be human compatible, because they're meant to house server or computer rooms, which means their temperatures are going to be optimized for computers, the materials are going to be optimized for computers. There's a certain level of human safety because people have to go in there at some level, right? But the fire suppression, for example, is going to be optimized to putting out electrical fires, not fires that happen in a kitchen, right? And a lot of times those fire suppression systems in a computer room assume that the doors are locked, or will even kick off a procedure that automatically locks the door. So when the system goes off, people are not present and put in harm's way. Threats to physical access control. So no matter which physical access control is used, a security guard or a monitoring system needs to be deployed to prevent abuses of the controls, like propping open secure doors and bypassing locks. Masquerading, using somebody else's security ID to gain an entry to a facility. See this all the time with folks that have vendors on site for the day. They'll just lend their card to a vendor that wants to go for a smoke break or something. Then potentially giving them access to a server room. So you have to watch that sort of thing. And then piggybacking, which is following someone through a secured gate or doorway without being identified or authorized. So somebody else swipes a badge, for example, opens the door, and then the person piggybacking just catches the door behind them before it closes, right? So no masquerading and piggybacking as well. Securing a wiring closet. So no security concerns of a wiring closet. First and foremost, preventing physical unauthorized access is going to be first and foremost, right? Because I can go in there and I can pull cables and cause disruptions. I can potentially put a tap in place so I can eavesdrop on your communications. Lots of negative there, but with the wiring closet, physical security first and foremost. Everything else is going to be secondary, because once I'm in the closet, there's little you can do, right? Understand how to handle visitors in a secure facility. So if a facility employs restricted areas to control physical security, there needs to be a mechanism to handle visitors. So maybe an escort is assigned to visitors, and their activities are monitored. They have to have somebody accompanying them. You may have a badge on them that says visitor requires escort. Tracking actions of outsiders when they're granted access to prevent malicious activity is going to be key for most protected assets. There needs to be deterrence and some sort of denial, and certainly an audit trail of one sort or another. Understand needs for media storage as well. This could well come up on the exam, and this feels less relevant, in 2021. But media storage facilities, folks still do use tape out there. It's not unheard of, and we do have all sorts of storage devices. So media storage facilities have to be designed to securely store blank, reusable, and installation media. So concerns are going to include theft, corruption, data remnant recovery. So when we erase something, it's not fully erased. So for example, like with a hard drive, I said that just deleting data still leaves it there, recoverable by forensic means. So we can kick off an overwrite that overwrites the drive with ones or zeros. We can use a degaussing tool to send a charge through and wipe a device. Your media facility protections should include locked cabinets or safes, a librarian or a custodian that is a gate, an access gate to said cabinets or safes. Implementing a check-in or check-out process, which could be facilitated or administered by a librarian or custodian for sure. And using media sanitation. Lots of media sanitation, techniques out there. One of the simplest is shredding, right? We have confidential paper documents we shred. I mentioned degaussing. That's not going to be effective for a lot of the modern storage devices. But check the CISSP official study guide. Try to memorize some of the media sanitation. I really don't think that's going to be front and center according to the skills measured, but worth having a look at as your time allows. And let's talk about evidence storage. So when we think about evidence, we need to retain logs, drive images, snapshots, data sets for internal investigations or potentially external forensic investigations with law enforcement. So protections for evidence storage include locked cabinets or safes, dedicated isolated storage facilities, offline storage, access restrictions and activity tracking, and hash management and encryption. At the end of the day, chain of custody is important for evidence when it comes to legal proceedings. We'll touch on this in a later domain, but when it comes to evidence, we're trying to at the end of the day protect that chain of custody, because the integrity of that evidence would be of paramount concern. Audit trails and access logs, very useful tools for managing physical access control. Because in part, like at a front desk, right, that if we use audit trail and if we use an access log to sign folks in, that helps. It's a good deterrent control when we think about electronic audit trails for privileged operation. So we may need to create access logs manually, like by a security guard. They can be automated with the right equipment if you've got, smart cards, for example, that folks use to log in. You can also monitor entry points with closed-circuit TV. That way we can compare the audit trail with the closed-circuit TV to see if what the sign-in log says happened actually happened. If the sign-in log says one person entered, but CCTV footage shows two people entering, then we have a divergence in the recorded events. Why are these important? Well, at the end of the day, it's critical to reconstructing the events of an intrusion and a breach or an attack. Whether we're talking about physical audit trails and access logs to physical entry and exit to a building, or electronic logs, related to sign in and administrative activities in a computing system. So the need for clean power. So power supplied by electric companies isn't always consistent and clean, meaning it's not always at the same level and coming without spikes and drops. So we talked about the six impacts to electrical power. So most of your equipment requires clean power in order to function properly and to potentially avoid damage. A UPS, uninterruptible power supply, is a type of self-charging battery that can be used to supply consistent clean power to sensitive equipment in the event of power failure. So number one, if we have a problem with the consistency of our power and we have to drop back to battery while it's repaired, we can do that. Or if power drops altogether, we can supply power for minutes or hours depending on the size of our UPS. And when organizations build data centers, they look at a UPS that can run their entire data center for a period of hours, and they'll even look beyond that to generators to provide power on an ongoing basis. And there you have it. That is Domain 3 of the CISSP exam. I hope you found this installment useful. Make sure you hit the notification bell when you subscribe to the channel so you get the heads up on domains 4 through 8. And until next time, take care and stay safe.